The envelope was still in my coat pocket when I walked back into the reception hall. Nobody noticed I had left. Nobody noticed I came back. I stood near the doorway for a moment, watching my daughter-in-law's family laugh at the table nearest the dance floor, and I thought, this is the last time I will stand in a room and feel invisible on purpose. I put my hand in my pocket and felt the edge of the envelope, still there, still sealed. I turned around and walked back out. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Gerald. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer for a firm in Columbus, Ohio. I'm not a dramatic man. I do not raise my voice. I have never in my life made a scene at a family gathering, and until that Saturday in April, I had never walked out of one either. I married my wife, Renata, when I was 34. She was 31. She had a son from her first marriage, a boy named Marcus, who was 6 years old when I met him and 9 when I became his stepfather. I want to be careful here, because Marcus is not the villain of this story. He was a child. He grew into a decent man. Whatever happened between him and me over the years, I do not place that on him. What I place on him is his silence. But I will get to that. Renata and I had a daughter together, our daughter Claire, who was born 2 years into our marriage. Claire is now 26. She lives in Portland with her husband and their dog, and she calls me every Sunday without fail. She is the reason I stayed as long as I did. She is also the reason I finally left. Not because of anything she did, but because she looked at me one evening about 18 months ago and said, "Dad, I can see you disappearing." And she was right. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The wedding I'm talking about was Marcus's son's wedding. My step-grandson, Daniel, was getting married to a young woman named Priya. It was a beautiful venue, a restored farmhouse about 40 minutes outside of the city. White lights strung along the rafters, round tables with wildflowers in mason jars. Priya's family had flown in from 3 different states. The whole thing was warm and lovely and entirely beyond anything I felt I was a part of. I had known for weeks that the seating arrangement would be what it was. I found out by accident Claire had been on a call with Marcus's wife, Deborah, and I heard her say my name in a tone that made me stop walking down the hallway. When she hung up, she came to find me in the kitchen and said very carefully, "Dad, they put you at a side table, not the family table." She watched my face. I told Deborah that wasn't right. She paused. She said it was already finalized. I told Claire it was fine. It was not fine. But I had been telling myself things were fine for a long time. Here's what I mean. When Marcus was a teenager, he went through a period of making it very clear that I was not his father. That is normal. I understand that. I did not take it personally, not at 16, not even at 19. But when he was 25 and introduced me to his future in-laws as my mom's husband, something shifted in me. Not loudly, just quietly, the way a floorboard shifts. You don't notice it until you step on it years later and it gives way entirely. Renata never said anything when Marcus introduced me that way. She laughed a little and moved on to another topic. I watched her do it. I remember thinking, she knows, she saw it, she's choosing not to address it. And I told myself that was fine too. The envelope came about 6 weeks before the wedding. I'd been going through my father's things. My father, Gerald, had passed away the previous winter at 88, and I had been slowly, carefully working through the boxes that my sister and I had brought back from his house in Indiana. There were boxes of tools, boxes of old magazines, boxes of paperwork, and then there was a shoebox on the top shelf of the closet in his old office that I almost didn't open because I assumed it was more receipts, more old utility bills. Inside the shoebox was a letter, and underneath the letter was a bank document, and underneath the bank document was a photograph I had never seen before. The letter was from my father to me. It was dated 11 years earlier. It had never been sent. I sat on the floor of my father's office for a long time after I read it. My father, as it turned out, had known something I did not. He had known it for years. He had written the letter because he was ill at the time. This was during a health scare that turned out to be less serious than feared, and he had wanted to tell me while he still could. And then he recovered, and he put the letter in the shoebox, and he never said a word. What he knew was this: there was a savings account, set up decades ago, in my name and in Daniel's name, Marcus's son, my step-grandson. The money had been put there by my own mother before her death as a way of making sure that Daniel, the first grandchild, even a step-grandchild, would have something from our side of the family when the time came. My mother had always loved Daniel. She called him her bonus grandbaby. She used to send him birthday cards until she couldn't anymore. My father had been maintaining the account, contributing to it quietly over years. The balance, by the time I found the document, was just over $41,000. I sat with this for a long time. I did not tell Renata. I did not tell Claire, not at first. I needed to understand it myself before I could explain it to anyone else. What I kept coming back to was the photograph. It was a picture of my mother and Daniel at what looked like a county fair. Daniel was maybe 4 or 5 years old. He was eating something on a stick. My mother was laughing. I was not in the photograph. Renata was not in the photograph. It was just the two of them, and my mother was laughing the way she laughed when she was genuinely happy. Not for a camera, not for anyone. Nobody had shown me this photograph. Not my father, not Marcus, not Renata. Either they didn't know it existed, or someone had decided it wasn't mine to see. I chose to believe nobody knew, because the alternative was something I wasn't ready to sit with, not yet. I made a decision. I would bring the bank document and the letter to Daniel's wedding as a gift, not in a grand way, not to make a statement. I would put them in an envelope, seal it, and at the right moment, I would hand it to Daniel and tell him what it was. I would let him decide what to do with it. It was his. It had always been his. I told Claire the night before the wedding. She cried. She asked me why I hadn't said anything sooner, and I told her that I needed to be sure I was doing it for the right reasons, and not because I was angry. She asked me if I was angry. I told her I was working on it. The day of the wedding, I put on the charcoal suit I had bought for my own retirement dinner 2 years earlier. I put the envelope in the inside pocket. I drove to the farmhouse alone, because Renata and Marcus and Deborah were all arriving together in a separate car, a detail I had been informed of the previous week in a group text that I was added to as what appeared to be an afterthought. The ceremony was outside by a small pond at the edge of the property. Priya wore a deep gold dress. Daniel looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days and was happier for it. I sat in the third row. Renata sat in the front row next to Marcus. I watched Daniel say his vows. I watched him look at Priya the way you can only look at someone when you have decided, fully and without condition, that their life matters as much as your own. I thought about my mother, who had called this boy her bonus grandbaby and taken him to a county fair and laughed with him in a way I had only ever seen in a photograph. I did not cry, but I came close. At the reception, I found my table. It was near the back of the hall, close to the corridor that led to the kitchen. I was seated with two of Priya's cousins who had flown in from Atlanta, and an older gentleman named Walt, who turned out to be the farmhouse caretaker's father, and who was not, as far as either of us could tell, an official guest. Walt and I talked for a while about a certain kind of solitude that comes with getting older, the good kind, the kind you earn. I liked Walt very much. At some point during dinner, I got up to find the restroom. On my way back through the corridor, I passed the table where Renata was sitting with Marcus and Deborah and two of their friends. I heard my name, not spoken kindly. I stopped just outside the doorway. Renata was talking about the gift. She did not know it was an envelope with $41,000 and a letter from my dead father. She thought it was a card. She had seen me place an envelope in my coat pocket that morning, and she had apparently assumed, or perhaps hoped, that it was a plain card with a check inside, and she was telling the table, in a voice not quite low enough, that she had told me it was a big wedding and that a card was not appropriate, and that I had ignored her as I always did, and that honestly, she didn't know why she bothered. She called it embarrassing. I stood in the corridor. I waited for Marcus to say something. He had grown up in my house. He had eaten at my table every night for 9 years. I had taken him to his first baseball game. I had driven him to the ER at 2 a.m. when he broke his wrist in college and Renata was out of town. I waited for him to say, even once, even lightly, "Come on, that's not fair." He didn't. He laughed a little. It was a small laugh, not cruel, but not nothing. A permissive laugh. The kind that says, "I am not going to stop this." I walked back to my table. I sat down across from Walt, who was eating a piece of wedding cake with the focused contentment of a man who has made peace with most things. I put my hand in my pocket. I felt the edge of the envelope. I thought about Daniel. I thought about my mother at the county fair. I thought about 31 years of telling myself that things were fine. I excused myself from the table. I walked to the front of the hall, where the gift table was set up near the entrance. I did not put the envelope on the gift table. I walked outside. There was a man sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the parking lot. He had a paper cup and a duffel bag and the look of someone who had been walking for a long time. I almost walked past him. Then I stopped. I don't know exactly why I stopped. I have thought about it since, and I think it was something about the way he was sitting. Not hunched, not ashamed, just sitting. Present. Like he had as much right to be on that wall as anyone inside had to be at their table. I asked him if he was all right. He said he was fine, just resting. His name was Leonard. He had a quiet voice and clear eyes, and he thanked me for asking. We talked for a few minutes. He told me he had been staying at a shelter on the north side of the city, that he was trying to get documentation sorted out for housing assistance, that it was slow going. I told him I was an engineer, that I'd spent 30 years working with systems and that systems were slow until they weren't. He smiled at that. I reached into my coat pocket, and then I stopped, because it wasn't Leonard's envelope to have. It was never mine to give away. It belonged to Daniel. It had always belonged to Daniel, put there by a woman who called him her bonus grandbaby, and took him to a county fair and laughed with real joy in a photograph nobody had bothered to show me. I reached into my wallet instead. I had $80 in cash. I gave it to Leonard. He thanked me and I told him I meant it when I said good luck. Then I went back inside. I went directly to the main table where Daniel and Priya were sitting. Priya's mother was there, and two of Daniel's friends from college. I waited until there was a small pause in the conversation, and then I leaned down and I said, "Daniel, I have something for you. From your great-grandmother, and from your great-grandfather, and from me. It's been waiting a long time." I put the envelope on the table in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. He was 28 years old, and he had his grandfather Harold's eyes, a thing I had never noticed before. He picked it up. He opened it carefully. The way you open something when you sense it matters. He unfolded the bank document first, and I watched his face as he read the number. He read it twice. Then he took out the letter. I had made a copy for myself. The original was his, and I stepped back while he read it. Priya put her hand on his arm. He finished reading and he sat very still for a moment. Then he stood up and he hugged me. He held on for a moment longer than a polite hug requires, and I let him, because I understood. He said, "I didn't know she did this." I said, "Neither did I until 6 weeks ago." He said, "She always called me her bonus grandbaby." I said, "I know. I saw the picture." He pulled back and looked at me, and I could see him putting things together. The envelope, the letter, the fact that I had found it in a shoebox, the years in between. He said quietly, "Did you know? Before the shoebox?" I said no. I told him the truth, that I had found it by accident, that my father had written the letter 11 years ago and never sent it, and that I had sat on the floor of his office for a long time after I read it. He nodded. He asked me to sit down. Priya moved over to make room. I sat at the main table for the rest of the evening. Not because I had demanded it, not because I had made any kind of scene. I sat there because a 28-year-old man with his grandfather's eyes had moved over and made room. I didn't speak to Renata that night. She found me near the end of the reception when people were beginning to gather their things. She had heard, from Marcus, I assume, or perhaps from Deborah, or perhaps Daniel had said something. She had heard about the envelope. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about all the times I had said things were fine when they weren't. I thought about the corridor and the small laugh and 31 years of being the man her family tolerated rather than welcomed. I thought about my father on the floor of his office, writing a letter he never sent. I said, "I didn't think it would matter to you." She started to say something else. I told her I was tired, and I said good night, and I went to find Claire. Claire was waiting for me by the door. She had seen most of it, or enough of it. She took my arm as we walked out into the cool April air, and she didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "Are you okay?" I thought about it. I said, "I think I'm going to be. There are things I have done since that evening that I will not detail here, because they are the ordinary, quiet business of a man rearranging his life. I will say that I have a lawyer now, and that my finances are my own, and that I have had several conversations in the past year that I should have had a decade earlier. Some of them went well, some of them did not. Marcus and I have spoken twice. They were not easy conversations, but they were honest ones, and honest is more than we had managed in a long time. Daniel called me 3 weeks after the wedding. He had spoken with the bank. He had read the letter several more times. He asked if he could come visit, him and Priya both, and I said yes. They came on a Saturday in May. Priya made tea and Daniel brought the photograph, a copy he had made, one for him and one for me. My mother at the county fair, Daniel with something on a stick, both of them laughing. He set it on my kitchen table between us. I looked at it for a long time. I said, "She would have been so happy today." He said, "I think she already knew." I don't know exactly what he meant by that, but I have thought about it many times since, and each time it sits a little differently, a little more like peace. That is the thing about the truth. You can put it in a shoebox on a high shelf. You can write it in a letter you never send. You can arrange the seating at a wedding so that the man who loved your family quietly for 31 years is placed near the kitchen, close enough to hear the caretaker's father eat his cake. But you cannot put a number on what that man carries in his coat pocket, and you cannot decide for him when it is time to hand it over. He decides that himself, when he is ready, when the moment is right. When he has stood on enough stone walls and talked to enough men named Leonard and looked at enough photographs he was never supposed to see. He decides it himself, and when he does, the room changes. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the way a door opens. A soft click, a little light, and then the quiet, unhurried business of walking through.